It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Gareth Stedman Jones, who I've known over the years, but we haven't had this particular discussion before. Gareth, I always start by asking when and where a person was born.
Yes, I was born in Hampton Court, a nursing home next to Hampton Court.
That would be very grand.
Towards the end of 1942. And brought up in my first years in Teddington, Twickenham, Richmond, sort of time.
So, go back as far as you like on both sides of your family. Most people go back to their grandparents or before. What sort of people were they?
Well, my mother's teaching was. There was a lot of teaching in the family. My mother's father came from the Channel Islands. Again, we do have sort of family trees which go back to the 16th century or something, which I haven't, I must say, a very enthusiastic
the Stedmans or the Joneses?
No, these were called Legros. Indeed,
how do you spell that?
Legros. And one of the family legends was that, which I don't know whether it's true or not, that they originally came from Nantes, which of course is not so far from Jersey, and were in lace making and connected with the court and came over to Jersey in the French Revolution. One of them certainly, because we've got a portrait of him, was a sort of self-made miner shipping magnate around the Napoleonic Wars. My grandfather had bits of property in Jersey, much to my mother's dismay, gave it away because he was quite radical in his way. He didn't really believe in property. He had 5 daughters and married someone sort of quite prosperous, middle to upper middle class in Middlesex. Anyway, he taught. I think it became something of a struggle bringing up 5 daughters, but they all had some sort of further or higher education, so he did pretty well. He was a great believer in education, and one of my early memories was that between about 5 and 12 or something like that, he'd take me up to London and we'd go and look at various historic sites. Of course, in those days, London was, largely a bomb site in many areas, so we would look at city churches and law courts and so on and so on. But I've always been fascinated by historical records of one sort or another. I think I was probably, two family accounts. I mean, one was, of course, these 5 sisters. This is the middle of the war, so I think I was rather. I received undue attention from all these unmarried sisters at the time. So, on the one hand, I think it gave me probably. I owe a lot to that. It gave me a certain sort of self-confidence about being a sort of interesting person. Secondly, though, I mean, I think there was some dreadful nursing manual which people used at the time. I can't remember. It was definitely pre-Dr. Spock. And the idea was you got lots of fresh air, so I think I spent about 23 hours a day in a pram in the garden. That's anyway the sort of family memory, and otherwise that there were these very large saucepans in the kitchen, and whenever someone visited, I'd try and take the people to get the saucepans down so I could play with them. Anyway, we lived, and I suppose a very important memory was, I'll say a bit about my father in a moment, but I don't think I really saw my father until about 46, because he was in North Africa and then Italy, and I remember he came back. Well, I remember, I'm told.
Mm.
Well, I've got a sort of visual memory, but whether it's really a memory or whether it's what people have told me, which I've turned into a memory. Anyway, he came back from, he spent the last years of the war in Austria-Italian border, and he came back with a very big doll's house. And I gather I very much did a sort of classic Freudian thing, trying to sort of get him out of the house, and who is this man, why has he come? So anyway, that's one part of early memories. I mean, another was, a sense, well, I don't think I had a sense of the war, but I did have a sense of the fairly soon immediate post-war. My father came, it was a sort of...
What was his parents?
Well, his father was a smallholder. I mean, if one wants sort of romantic family legends, there was a family called Stedman, who dissolved the monastery in a place called Strata, Florida, which is just north of Aberystwyth. Indeed, he had some land, but very small amount by then, in the Strata, Florida area. He left, I think, 11 or 12. His parents died, and somehow he's brought up by a family called Jones, which is why Stedman Jones. He had two younger brothers. One went to South Africa. We're talking now about the 1880s. One went to South Africa. The other went to United States. One of them became an opera singer, told. Another, and he himself went to the mines. This was, I suppose, somewhere early in the 1880s. I mean, to try and support these younger siblings.
This is your father?
My father was, no, this is my grandfather.
I was going to say, how could he be?
Sorry, no. Yeah. My father was one of 6, I think, and 2 marriages. And he was born in 1913, I think. I mean, it was, and the grandfather had married someone from a place called Astraganus, which is in the back of beyond, up the Swansea Valley. Anyway, he, of these 6, the 3 boys did pretty well. He became, I think the grandfather ended up as sort of mine overseer. He got a university education, my father did, at Queen Mary College, and his elder brother became, who I don't know whether he did a degree by correspondence course, but actually there is a connection with Keynes, because he obviously did very well. In the war time, this is my uncle, he was seconded to the Ministry of Food, and then Keynes actually asked him to become a Fellow of King's after the war, but he preferred to stay in the civil service, so he ended up in the cabinet office. He was a very clever man. My father, the uncle, was sort of more mathematical and sort of ancient languages, a Welsh patriot in terms of the Welsh language and all this sort of thing. My father was much more literary. He wanted to be a writer, but for my mother might well have become one. Well, he did write, but he wrote sort of as an ancillary thing to being a school teacher. He was, he became head of English when Holland Park was founded, which was one of the first sort of comprehensives in London. Yes, there used to be a series in the Evening News, I think, called The World's Strangest Stories. That was a good way of adding to his income. And then there was a BBC thing called the Mid-Morning Short Story, and he wrote quite a few of those. But the main thing from my point of view was that he really did love literature. His hero was Dr. Johnson. After the war somewhere they collected 18th century books, so I had the whole run of not the Gentleman's Magazine but the London Magazine, which I remember reading quite avidly when I was 10 or 11. So by that stage, yes, we were living in Teddington and then Twickenham quite comfortably. And I think from his enthusiasm, he was very keen that I should learn to write properly. So, in fact, he gave me exercises to do. He'd sort of give me a Somerset Maugham short story and say, "Can you write a page in that style?" This sort of thing. It must have been by him, but I got very enthusiastic when I was about 12 or 13 and read through most of Dickens. My engagement with the 19th century was very much before even being a historian. It was about really being sort of inspired by that. And I went to a sort of local prep school, and
was it day school?
Day school, yes. It was not very far away, called the Mall in Twickenham. Anyway, and they had a sort of ancient library. Ancient, just a library which they had never bothered to renew. But it did mean I read strange things. Like there was a whole collection of an author you've probably heard of called J.A. Henty.
Yes, of course.
With Kitchener to Khartoum, all these sorts of things. I read loads of those. And because they knew I was interested in books, they asked me to help sort of reclassify the library. This was before I left the school. And then I went on to St Paul's. Let's
slow you down a moment.
Okay.
And you explained the influence of your father, and you mentioned your mother. What were they both like as people, and how did this influence you?
My mother had a very iron will, and I think, without psychologizing too much, she was the second of these 5 sisters. She was she very much wanted to make to be her father's favourite. So she always had a slightly de haut en bas attitude to the other sisters, without much justification, I should say. She was very practical. She could redecorate rooms and sort of make dresses and that sort of thing. She slightly resented the fact that her 2 younger sisters had got to either the Slade or the LSE, whereas she had to go to Goldsmiths, and she thought she was really cut out to be a doctor, and she should have had a chance to do a medical degree. So there was always a slight edge of disappointment. She was very she was sort of progressive, but she was also very firmly sort of aware of middle class, politesse sort of thing. My father, coming from just outside Merthyr, was a much more potentially outward going. He liked going to pubs and talking to people. And in those days, of course, because there'd been this major migration of Welsh people out of the valleys in the 30s, in the 50s, when I was growing up, there was all this London Welsh diaspora, which I was sort of inducted into, as it were, with various, and a lot of them seemed to settle in West London, and so that they were quite, they were much jollier types in some ways. They'd all put a big value on education. My mother was much more, I think, sort of materially minded, actually, whereas my father would have been the delight in learning, and of course he'd been brought up in a very religious household, even though he was no longer religious particularly. So, again, part of it might be family mythology, but the argument or the stories were of the two older brothers, or maybe the three of them, sort of sitting around talking about Plato or something in this mining village before they sort of disappeared from it. He was also, I mean, I don't think he, I think in a way he wasn't, his character wasn't strong enough to stand up against my mother, so he probably could have been a good writer, but, you know, he very much deferred to her, and of course there was a certain sense of the superiority of the home counties over the Welsh valleys. So, and sometimes there would be good-humoured or sometimes not so good-humoured arguments about, you know, what did people in Richmond Twickenham know about the Depression and this sort of thing, and so on the whole he was quite radical. My mother was sort of, I mean, she was radical, but she could come up with some quite shocking statements and sort of slightly racist kind now and again and that sort of thing. I don't think very thought out, and actually next to the family we first grew up with was her childhood friend, who was is a Jewish family, and they taught in the, or they didn't teach, they sold and stuff in the East End, but they took that long Richmond to Bishopsgate or Liverpool Street train anyway. So she was quite philo-Semitic, but they're all quirky, her attitudes, whatever they were. Anyway, they were obviously on the whole agreed that...
Did you have brothers and sisters? Or?
No, I was an only child.
Yeah.
My father also, I think I should say, had a pretty nasty temper. My mother would just go cold and lock herself in the bedroom. My father would storm around and sort of, I'd try and keep myself scarce. So it wasn't, I don't want to give the impression it was idyllic. On the whole, it was okay.
Did you have any...
I was brought up with my cousin. We shared a big house originally. And she also became an academic philosopher at UCL. So it was a bit like having a sister up to the age of about 11ish. But on the whole, I think my character traits are those of an only child, in a sense.
Did you have any particular hobbies or interests as a boy at that time?
Yes.
Nature or collecting, or?
I collected coins for a bit. And then I collected old books. I was quite keen on sport, but I wasn't terribly good at sports. So cricket I followed quite a lot. And, you know, I had friends at local various schools and local youth club and things like that. So, but I also had obviously quite a strong intellectual side. And when I was about 17 in St Paul's, someone called Richie Blackburn, whose brother is Robin Blackburn, he came to St Paul's for the it was called the 8th form at the time. So I got to know that family quite well, and that was the way in which I got into the New Left, really, was through them. And I mean, if I talk about St Paul's, I had two very sort of inspirational teachers. One was French and the other was in history.
You remember their names?
They'd both been in the First World War. One was called Frank Parker, and I think it's Parker, yes. And he, I remember, produced this list of about 50 items, said, this is modernism, and this, if you want to be anybody in the world, you've got to have read these books, which I took fairly seriously. It wasn't just in French, I mean, it was, but it did mean I took it French A-level, and I really enjoyed that, and got more and more francophone as the time went on. And the other one was was a very exceptional history teacher. He's called Philip Whitting, and he produced people like Max Beloff, and then someone I was compared with somehow you'd no doubt know. He was in Oxford. Mark Elvin. He was a few years my senior.
Mark Elvin?
Yes.
Oh yes.
And he'd also been...
he was at the Dragon School.
Oh, was he? Right. Okay. Well, he was also... I mean, I did pretty well in this form, and they said, well, you may be like Mark Elvin. So,
he was a prodigy.
Anyway, so... And I learnt an awful lot from him, and he had very... This is Whitting. He had, in the way in which those schools, some of the teachers could be quite eccentric. They could have their own views, and although he wasn't radical in a way that one would now recognise very much, his reputation was being radical, mainly because he was very sort of ironic about organised religion, and of course at the time it was very much part of the definition of the school. He knew all about Byzantium, which was a sort of rather exotic thing to know about. He very good on Louis XIV, and I remember, I think I was inspired by him to do so, reading Aldous Huxley's stuff on that, and the memoirs of Saint-Simon. And he gave scrolls and scrolls of notes, which were very good. But the thing was, because it was a very privileged school, of course, but he had his little study under the staircase, and he would give you basically supervisions like you would get here. So actually, when I went to Oxford, it was no big deal as far as I was concerned. Same sort of thing. And he was very good again at sort of making sure you didn't write any cliches, you didn't, the argument was clear and the rest of it. So I learned an awful lot from him. In fact, last year I was very pleased.
It was the last 2 years you had him, did you?
Yes. I got invited last year to give the Philip Whitting Memorial Lecture, which they still have at the school, so he obviously made a sort of impact on the school itself. And, they were very, very bright lot in that class. But it was very much, okay, you've got to do your A-levels, but basically it's the scholarship that's going to matter, and so you don't have to take that too seriously. And then they put me in for a trial run, because they said, well, you'll go to Balliol or something like that, but why don't you try a year early? So I did, and so I went to Lincoln. And having got the scholarship, I thought, well, there's no point in hanging around in school for another year. And what I did was, my father at school had got to know someone who was a French exchange teacher, who was actually became quite a prominent journalist. And he was working for Agence France Presse. So I left school, I got the scholarship in the December. I left at the end of that term. I went to Paris and got this job as a sort of copy boy in Agence France Presse. So it was really exciting. I went with two school friends who were also keen. One was called David Orkin, who became sort of quite a well-known theatre producer with the RSC and this sort of thing, and the other was, I think he worked for the BBC, called John Gilbert. Anyway, we went and found places to live in Paris. We originally thought we were going to this university course which Paris had at the time, but I didn't really follow that, and because I had the job I didn't see much point in doing so, but I did read quite a lot. It was very anti-social hours. It was 6 to midnight, and it was a place called Fontenay-Rose. So I mean, it was only the last couple of months where I could socialise and sort of had built up enough resources to not work for the last couple of months. I very much, by that stage, quite I mean, you have to put it in the context that it was a sort of time when.
What year is this? This must be...
We'd be talking about 1959.
Mm-hmm.
No, sorry. I went up in 1961, so
Yes.
it must be 1960.
Yeah.
Because when I was in Paris, one of the things that did happen, which I witnessed, was the French general's attempt at a coup.
Mm.
And I did get to know in the last couple of months some various Germans who I still see, and they were quite sort of keen on doing little errands for the FLN, so I did sort of have a sense of what was going on. And of course from working in Agence France Presse, where you were literally taking the news off the machines and taking them to the relevant journalists and this sort of thing. So that was really good.
Just to skip one thing at school before you move on, which is really what other things you were doing at St Paul's. I mean, you said games wasn't particularly your thing, but were you doing anything else like drama, music, art?
Yes, well, there were bits which were compulsory, which I really disliked. I mean, the worst thing being a sort of the school was divided into 8 houses or whatever, and there was compulsory.
You weren't boarding, or were you?
No,
yeah.
day boy.
Yeah.
But there was compulsory boxing competition in these wretched houses, and the nightmare was trying to get out of that. And another thing which I disliked was the CCF. I tried going into the Scouts as an alternative, but eventually I tried just doing the games where you just went to the gym instead. They said you'll never get anywhere if you do that. So eventually it was quite funny in 1956, thereabouts. Anyway, Field Marshal Montgomery came to address the school as an old boy, and made us all sit down on the tarmac. And of course it was a hot day, so all the tarmac melted, so we didn't have CCF for the rest of the term because they all had to be sent to the cleaners. Well, those were things I didn't particularly like, and in fact I played truant several times trying to avoid CCF. But yes, I was in the school orchestra. I played an oboe. I was quite keen on that. We set up a sort of drama cum culture society. I remember we managed to get Graham Greene to speak, and we organised a little collective trip to see a Pinter play, I think, and maybe some others. We call it the Gallery Club. And that all worked out. I mean, that was quite exciting, actually. The sport, as I say, I wasn't terribly good at, but I quite enjoyed it, so I wasn't alienated at all from the sport, except this awful boxing business. Yes, at school I did classics. I mean, I did Latin and Greek in O-level, and then Latin at A-level, and history and French. I mean, I basically enjoyed the time there. And by the end of it, they were, particularly once I'd got to Oxford and so on, they were allowing me to give mini lectures. And that stage, I remember I must have, because the new left had sort of seeped into my consciousness, 56, as far as I was concerned, was the big change, because, I mean, both Suez and Hungary, until, I remember thinking, at first, well, maybe Suez was something to be said for it and all that, and it was eventually just seemed monstrous, but on the commute, which was on the district line, and the next door but one was a sort of civil servant, and he had gone to St Paul's. He said, well, of course they're doing the right thing, this sort of stuff. And his main regret was that we got out of India, this sort of thing. So, so anyway, that was the year I remember thinking, you know, joining CND and very much defining myself against what that politics and culture, and I developed what I now see to be pretty sort of unreasonable hostility towards the suburbs, as I thought of them. I mean, these were quite nice places to live when I now look back. But at the time I was full of contempt for the sort of provincialism of the place. And actually going to Paris made it worse, because I sort of felt even more superior to the local surroundings.
We were swept up in, this is 56, is when Elvis is first.
Yes. No, that was another...
Lonnie Donegan and...
That was a cultural change, I remember. You had to go to school on Saturday morning to play sport, I think. So first year or two, I think I wore cavalry twills and a cravat and this sort of stuff. And then I remember we were taken on a school trip because one of the people in the form, their parents had some, no doubt, quite good position in Gillette, I think it was, on the Great West Road. And so we all went, was it Firestone Tires? It's one of those anyway. But we'd taken around the factory, and then we could sort of spend half an hour in a cafe or something, and there was a jukebox. It was the first time I heard Elvis and Blue Suede Shoes. Up until then...
There's Rock Around the Clock had just come out before that.
But before then, one felt under some sort of social pressure to learn to do foxtrots and quick steps and waltzes and so on. And I think it even started at some little dance academy. And again, that was the great liberation. You just gave all that all up, and sort of thereafter moved from cavalry twills to jeans and Ray Charles. Yes.
It was the time when the new drama was just coming out, Look Back in Anger.
Yes. Well, as I say, this gallery club, we were following that as far as we could. So in some ways it felt an exciting time, and in fact if I thought about it in the sort of longer durée, I mean all the way from 56 through to somewhere early in the 70s, it felt as if the world was changing in rather exciting ways and sort of good ways on the whole. So I think in retrospect I was jolly lucky to sort of have the best of that post-war prosperity, not having to worry, not having to have a memory of the war itself particularly, only the stories about the war.
One of the things that happened, and you said St Paul's was a religious school, is that this is the time for confirmation and things like this. Were you confirmed?
Yes. I mean, it was sort of a fairly sort of military operation. I mean, and at that stage, well, I remember thinking, well, it could be true. So I didn't have strong anti-religious feelings. On the other hand, the school chaplain, or whoever taught us divinity, was not very bright, so we made all sorts of jokes. I mean, it was we regarded it as ridiculous, but I don't think we were fundamentally alienated from religion, although we were alienated from organised religion in the way it was practiced at school.
And what's your position been since then, over time?
It's sort of agnostic. I sort of think rather like, Bernard once said to me that,
Bernard Williams.
Yes. Anglican atheism is really what I quite like the rituals of the Church of England if I had to choose. I don't believe in God and all that, but and obviously I don't well, it was reinforced by reading Hegel, because the idea that this happens to be the religious culture that has been on this island, and I don't feel any strong urge to disrupt it more than, except when it behaves in a ridiculous way. So so I suppose agnostic is probably the...
What do you think of I tend to ask people of the strong atheist attack on religion, Dawkins, Hitchens type?
I think it's a bit childish. I mean, my question is not is there a God? But what is God? What is God? I mean, and Hegel has a quite interesting answer to that, which is just it's everything. I mean, a sort of pantheism of sort. And if you want to call that God, fine. I mean, I don't, and I don't see. I mean, once upon a time, if England had stayed as it was in the 1950s, and at school I did read with enthusiasm all those essays by Bertrand Russell about why I'm not a Christian and all that sort of thing. Had England stayed like that, I dare say I would have felt more on the Dawkins sort of line, but I don't. It seems to me attacking something which really isn't that central. And I find myself in this sort of slightly ridiculous position that the people who seem to say quite sensible things, I mean, are like the Church of England or senior judges or people in the House of Lords or whatever. I mean, I don't, with any comfort, approve of any of these things particularly. But on the other hand, you know, it's one of the areas where a certain pluralism survives, and so for that reason, I suppose I feel that the alternatives might be worse these days.
The worst of all religions except the rest, which is even worse. Yes. Okay. Well, after your exciting year, I mean, I'm going to ask a personal question about Paris. Paris, for our fevered imaginations, I was a year older than you, would be synonymous with Moulin Rouge and young ladies and things like this. Did that play any part in?
Well, I'd already had girlfriends at home who I met at the local grammar school, girls' grammar school. We tended to meet in the youth club, that's where it started. And then one of them was a musician, so to follow her I joined the Middlesex Youth Orchestra. And, you know, that's where my sort of sexual apprenticeship began, I suppose. And that was, actually, it was very nice. But I was determined, had to make my way in the world. I had this, as I say, this sort of slightly, I'm not staying in these suburbs longer than I have to sort of thing. So when I went to Paris, actually, I think sexually that's a pretty barren time. I mean, I don't think anything happened specifically. Well, no, I was in one encounter I do remember, because it's rather strange, was going to see, but this was in Hounslow, not in Paris, and God Created Eve or something like that, which was an early Brigitte Bardot film.
Yes, that's right. And
coming out of the cinema, and I felt I was being very bold, just slipping off and seeing this film, in a long alley beside two people who had obviously had something to drink lurched into me. I said something like, watch where you're going or something. And the next time I was lying on the floor and seeing stars. I'd always thought those things in comics were made up, but actually. So I was clearly interested in what was thought to be sexually alluring and was associated with French things, but I don't think. I think, well, you know, I think my impression at the time was that the sorts of girls you'd meet in Paris were like American girls about to go to their universities or whatever it might be, or German girls or whatever. Actually, French girls were hardly to be seen by foreigners. It wasn't until later on that I got to a much deeper sort of, or more intimate knowledge anyway, of Paris, because that was when I went to Nuffield, and there were two really good French anthropologists who came over who were students of Lévi-Strauss. One who you certainly know, presumably, called Dan Sperber, and the other, I think he ended up as a clochard. It was all very sad, but he's called Pierre Smith, I think, and he had a connection with some royal member of the royal family in Rwanda or something like that. But anyway, the point was that through them I got to know other people in Paris, and in the 60s, I remember thinking that, for all the sort of interest in Sartre and so on and so on, actually Britain was a culturally more enlightened place. I mean, I remember around 67, 68, but their idea of an exciting Saturday night was to play bridge and have Louis Armstrong in the background. So I just did think, there was had a lot to learn. But anyway, I kept up this French connection quite a lot, and when I was in Oxford, my girlfriend again was someone who'd been to Paris, so we shared this sort of knowledge of Paris, and she became an anthropologist, come to think of it, worked on gypsies.
Oh, Judith Oakley, or?
Judith Oakley.
Yes, I thought it was.
So, no, I sort of keep bumping into anthropologists, because then the person I married, called Gay Webber, was also an anthropologist for a time with, who was it in Oxford in the Institute in the 60s?
Leonhardt, or what?
Yeah, well, the Leonhardt, we used to go down to that pub and sort of, and Evans Pritchard and so on, all, that was quite jolly. But there was someone who was Levi-Straussian, I think, and
Needham.
Yes, that's right. So all the way through, I had a certain connection with them, and actually did affect when I did Outcast London, I had read Mose and Gift Exchange and all that sort of thing, which to historians at the time anyway was quite novel stuff. So
we'll come to that in a moment.
Yeah.
Let's get to Lincoln.
Yes.
What was Lincoln like? Who did you meet there that influenced your life?
Well, it's very sad because he died last year, but I found myself next to, I'd got this history scholarship, the other history scholar was placed in the room next to me. He was a sort of larger than life person called Angus Hone. He was about 6'5". He came from Malvern, he'd been to Malvern School, or Tewkesbury, something like that. But he had a Scottish mother. Anyway, when he came to Oxford, he insisted on wearing a kilt. So everyone knew who he was at the time. And he was a great enthusiast for everything, and he wanted to meet everybody. So people were continually going in and out of his room, and so I met a lot of my generation, as it were, who he thought worth meeting, through being next door to Angus. And then we continued through into the third year when we lived out in the Woodstock Road, and so again it was Angus, someone called Roderick Flood, who's a sort of
Roderick. Yes, I know.
And someone called Charles Drace Francis, who became an ambassador in somewhere like Honduras, and he got done in by this person who financed the Ashcroft.
Yes.
I mean, he had a rather sad end of his diplomatic career because he got in the way of this guy. But anyway, it was a very enjoyable time, I must say. I really enjoyed Oxford, and I was very happy in the end that I ended up in Lincoln. It was a perfectly decent little college. Now I gather it's quite sort of top of the league and the rest of it. Then it was a very middle of the road sort of, not especially distinguished college. Actually, very funny because one of the tutors was called VHH Green, who everyone would know from school A levels and everything, and he became apparently the model for Smiley in the what's his name,
Le Carré,
who had also been to Lincoln. And it was very strange because he had a room which I think allegedly belonged to John Wesley once upon a time, and it was about twice as large as this, but all along the wall were these teddy bears sitting in rows, and then he, although he was the chaplain of the college, always wore a suede suit, which again had a certain, I mean, he was actually a much less interesting person than that suggests. I mean, perfectly straightforward, I think, and his history wasn't terribly inspiring. The other history tutor, called John Owen, was actually a much sharper person who'd been one of the early followers of Namia. No, there were a number of people in history and modern languages. I got very interested in economics while I was in Oxford. So, first of all, from this New Left connection, there was a sort of Leaversite New Left paper called New University. It's called, or was it The University? Anyway, which was terribly worthy in a sort of David Holbrook sort of way. And one of my friends at the time, well, through Oxford, was Alexander Cockburn. And we tried to set up this more journalistically snappy sort of journal newspaper called The University Messenger. So there was this New Left culture sort of going on at the time, and that's right. But eventually I got involved in ISIS, and so did Angus and Mary Caldor, and we were sort of more or less running that for a term or two probably, and terribly interested in, at the time, sort of theories about the Third World and economics of development, and there were a number of people who were thought to be sympathetic, economists and so on, all of whom were, well, I remember going to quite a few seminars about that, and an interest obviously could continue easily enough when we went to Nuffield.
There were a number, I mean, you were 1 year behind me, and so we had roughly the same history teachers, and the big hitters at that time were people like Christopher Hill, Lawrence Stone, Trevor Roper, and the background sort of Ale Rouse and so on. But did you encounter any of them at that time?
Yes. Well, at school, I read Christopher Hill very thoroughly. So that was the sort of area which I knew best when I went to Oxford. He was rather disappointing as a sort of lecturer and things. I went to yes, I read Trevor Roper as well, and went to one or two of his seminars, but he was very sort of I remember him sending people away if they didn't wear a gown, that sort of thing. And the person I think I was most enthusiastic about at the time was Lawrence Stone, because he ran, well, I suppose that it became the lectures on the crisis of the aristocracy, but definitely made a point of going to all those.
Packed out, weren't they? People sitting on the windowsills.
That's right, and I think I got to know him just in a way that an undergraduate might, sort of, at least he knew who I was. And the other person who I did go to, who again was very good value, was Jack Gallagher.
Oh, yes.
He had just come, I think, and he gave these lectures. That's right, now it's coming back to me. I mean, although I was at Lincoln, the sort of circles I was closer to, I think, were in Balliol, and particularly around Richard Cobb, and Gallagher had gone there too, well, Angus was always looking out for who were the bright, who we ought to be meeting, and so there's Derek Parfit and someone called Anthony, I can't remember his second name now. He became a publisher and did very well with resurrecting this thing called the Edwardian Lady's Diary. Anyway,
yes,
and there was Robin Briggs, well, I didn't know him at the time. But anyway, yes, I think it was Lawrence Stone above all, and Gallagher, who were the two most inspiring. Oh yes, and Hoskins, I rather liked.
Lecturing at All Souls. giving seminars at All Souls.
Because I got very interested. There was a really nice paper I remember called 16th Century Economic Documents.
Yes, I did that.
Yeah. And he was quite inspiring in his way, and I enjoyed that. And the other person who was a bit of a guru, because he didn't publish much, but had a reputation, was Macfarlane.
Yes, KB.
Not any name.
No, KB Macfarlane.
Right.
Yes.
But sort of things about bastard feudalism. That's and all sorts of things were very exciting.
You go to Keith Thomas's political philosophy lectures?
Yes, yeah, the three.
Rousseau,
Aristotle and Hobbes, or Rousseau.
Hobbes, yes.
Yeah. Yes, no,
he was a good lecturer.
He was a good lecturer, and I got very excited. But when did Decline of Magic come out? It was after
71.
Yes,
70.
oh, right. But I remember because I ran something called the Stubbs Society.
Oh, you ran that?
Well, for a year, and invited Keith Thomas to give one of the talks. No, that was very exciting because it all seemed to be, well, again on the anthropology sort of side, sort of bringing together.
He just published his paper on anthropology and history, past and present, in '63. So
right.
It was just happening then. The other thing overshadowing you, as well as these historians, was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh yes,
you must remember that.
Yes, I remember turning up to some protest meeting in St Giles. And of course I was still, well, when I first came to Oxford, they parachuted me almost immediately into being secretary of the Oxford Student CND, together with Nick, he was at this college, Humphrey.
Oh yes.
There was him and Jonathan Howard, who was a sort of who was the son of Margarita Lasky. So I got to know quite a few people straight away in Oxford through the sort of CND connections, and I remember we did a march around Oxford, which was supposed to follow the crater that would be made if a bomb landed on Oxford.
This must have been in sort of, well, the crisis started in the autumn and then went through the winter into the beginning of '63.
Yeah. So
it was autumn '62, '63.
Well, it was obviously a period where nuclear war didn't seem inconceivable as sort of something that might happen.
There'd been the Berlin crisis too earlier in the year.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I do remember, because also, no, that must have been a year afterwards in Nuffield. But through some connection, we were invited, I mean, we being, I think, the executive committee of CND, to go to Shape or somewhere like that, and hear the sort of NATO case. So yes, all that was going on, and then quite involved in the Labour Club. One of the people again who was very active at the time, although his politics then seemed to be exactly the same as they are now, on the sort of cusp between sort of left and right, which is Simon Jenkins.
Oh yes.
So I think I was quite active in various sort of, I mean, I never liked being, I've never been particularly a sort of organiser. I've just preferred to be, as far as that goes, a foot soldier, but to write things now and again.
Did you have anything to do with Ruskin College?
Later on I did.
Yes.
One of the people, obviously through, I suppose, New Left connections, it wasn't even that, no, actually, to be fair. Jonathan Howard had a rather beautiful sister called Lydia Howard, and I was very keen on her, I remember, and before I'd been keen on her, Tim Mason had been very keen on her, and before that, Raphael, had had a relationship with her. So Raphael, I think, got to know me because he was sort of, in a way, worried about Lydia. So that was the origin of our meeting. And he'd just, I think, been given some sort of position via Christopher Hill in Ruskin, but he lectured a bit part-time before then anyway, because he'd been in retreat from politics in Ireland and developed rather sentimental views of Ireland being completely different sort of thing. Anyway, having got to know him, I got to know him quite well.
What date was this?
I must have met him from time to time as an undergraduate. By the third year, I probably sort of knew him a bit better. Yes, I must have gone to see his house in Spitalfields, and then when he did come to Ruskin, he had this idea, which was, to put on these history workshops, which started as a much more modest affair, but they were basically getting the students to do dissertations and then pairing them with sort of academics, sympathetic academics. So that would be about 65, 66, that sort of time. I remember participating in those things. And at the time I was quite intrigued by the earlier history of the New Left, because another person I got to know was Edward Thompson. And of course all these people actually didn't like each other very much. I mean, there was Perry.
Perry Anderson.
Yes. So that Raphael didn't trust Edward. Perry didn't like the old New Left. I was sort of, at the time, thought of myself as a sort of mediator between the two, because I rather admired, obviously, Perry Anderson's Origins of the Present Crisis at the time, but I also, my interest in history. So, I greatly enjoyed the sort of company of Edward, although he's a bit of a bully, and Eric Hobsbawm I must have got to know at the same time. So I knew all those people and tried to keep myself not too parti-pris between them. But Raphael I got to know more closely, and again, I didn't actually agree with him a lot of the time. I mean, I've always been rather sceptical about history from below and all that sort of thing. However,
why sceptical?
Sceptical because my fantasy, at least, was that a historian's like a dramatist, and you can see the various different players, as it were, from different positions. So, I mean, it wasn't that the sort of work that people did practicing history from below couldn't be very interesting. It was just the moralistic ethos that went with it I didn't sort of quite see the point of, except if it made people do some oral history and ask people who normally were ignored, then that's fine. Yes, I remember sort of editing early on. It was one of the things that Raph had sort of set up. He was an old ex-railwayman. It was about railwaymen's slang. It was very interesting. I mean, but I suppose Raphael and I did basically agree. We thought history was very important, and that we could change the world by changing history, sort of thing, and that it was important that we somehow got out. It was a time, I suppose, when history seemed like have something to do with emancipation. I can't. It's harder to conceive now quite why one thought that, but that somehow it was a form of enlightenment, and it was a time when, certainly with Edward and Raymond Williams and people like that, I mean, there was the thought that they'd taken, education out of the universities were ivory towers, and you had to take learning out to the people, sort of thing. And also, one of my early experiences, which I went to stay with Edward Thompson, and we drove he was living in Halifax at the time, up to Cleveland, I think, and where he gave a talk, I think, on the Peterloo Massacre or something like that. Anyway, the class, it was quite inspiring. I mean, it really was a sort of secular creed. And one of the people who, older members of the class, had been Sidney Webb's electoral agent in 1924. So there's a strong sense of, Labour traditions having some real vitality at the time, which is why I didn't entirely go along with the New Left. I mean, New Left sort of had a lot of contempt for the New Left clubs, and they said we shouldn't go to pubs, we should go to cocktail bars, like Sweden, not so it's a very strong modernist sort of style, whereas the old New Left was much more Merry Englandish and sort of getting to know the people sort of thing.
So I don't know what degree you got after all that activity.
I got a first.
You got a first?
Yes.
See, I got a second. So. Anyway, congratulations. And
it was a rather strange. I remember it was a very bad year. Only 8 got first or something, and I did have a long set to in the Viva with Trevor Roper about because I was very keen on Anal at the time, and he thought I was just making it up, so we had to go through what I'd.
Did you go to John Cooper's lectures?
Yes, he also had. He didn't have a go, but he wanted to quiz me that I really did understand what the Ricardian theory of rent was about.
Because he was keen on Anal and used to lecture on.
He was good. He was good.
Good lecturer. So, and then how did you go on? You went on to Nuffield.
Yes, myself, Roderick, Angus, we all decided that Nuffield was the place, and Roderick and I decided that Habakkuk was the person we wanted to be supervised by, so we chose him, much to his surprise. And Charles went off to the diplomatic corps. Angus wanted to become an economist, so again it was, well, in some ways the sort of ethos of Nuffield was very narrow. I realised in retrospect what a liberation it was coming here and talking to scientists who are interested in larger questions of the world and and that they could talk in a comprehensible way, and obviously literature people and everything else, whereas in Nuffield it was just the social sciences, and that could be a bit oppressive. But having said that, there were some good people there. It was an intellectually stimulating place. But by that stage, I mean, yes, I knew I wanted to carry on doing research, but I also thought London was going to be much more exciting than Oxford. So partly that's why I chose London as being my PhD DPhil topic. Originally I was going to do something on self-help. Why was it that, because it was sort of provoked by the sort of, I suppose, New Left background, but why was it that in 1906, the people voted for liberalism in a big way, when, if you went back to Chartism and before, then liberalism was sort of under great suspicion. So I was interested in how did liberalism become a popular creed, and it was originally going to be around Samuel Smiles, and then as I read into the stuff it became clear that the place where it wasn't working at all was London. So that was the intellectual background, together with some French work. There's someone who's the author, I'd be able to tell you, but called Classe Laborieuse, Classe Dangereuse, or something like that. Chevalier was it?
Yes.
Anyway, that was another of triggers, as it were. And then meeting these French anthropologists also sort of helped me broaden the way I thought about it, particularly charity, which until then had been written in a fairly boring or worthy sort of way, but not a terribly exciting way. And that was, but at the time I was sort of undecided, or leaving it open, let's say, whether I would carry on in academia, or whether my fantasy was that we'd set up a sort of journal a bit like Libération, one of the sort of French progressive sort of journals. And we did try in the sort of 67, 68. I think it folded after 12 issues. But it was the idea that it was going to be Libération, but also Paris Match or Picture Post. I mean, the idea to bring radical photojournalism and sort of leftish news together. So that didn't work. But at the same time, I began to get more and more uncomfortable with the New Left lines, particularly the sort of more Trotskyist. I mean, people are talking about having a revolution in Europe, and I really didn't think we needed that. I think I was a sort of crypto-Fabian, actually. So one of the things I did was, having finished Outcast London, or I got a commission to write on Engels. I did that because the agent said, look, you could do Engels, Queen of Scots, which was the what's her name? That sort of biography. The idea I'd write a very readable biography was sort of thing. Whereas my feeling was, it'd be easy for me to stick to London and Victorian history. If I was going to broaden myself at all, this was the moment to do it. So, on the strength of this advance, I managed to get learn German, and eventually got a Humboldt scholarship. So I spent a year in Frankfurt, again in sort of rather interesting time, because it was just at the end of the SDS and the Baader Meinhof.
This is about
73,
yes.
Something like that. So that was fascinating, although I also thought that they were sort of crazy. I mean, in the sense of, I kept saying, well, actually, what's been happening in Britain is quite interesting. But they said, no, it's the Italian Spring. There was, factory occupations and sort of terrorism, which I didn't. I never. I mean, I knew some of the people who were involved, but so it's a very interesting moment. And that film that's recently come out, Baader Meinhof, I found was really good, actually. It brought a lot back, and the sense in which, just bad mistakes on the part of the authorities can just push something, change gear altogether. So, and at the same time, I'd got a job in. That's right. It shows when university cuts began, about 73, 74. I think I'm right in saying I was beginning to run out of the advance and all the things. So, and the Humboldt had come to an end. So, I needed to get a job, and I applied for this job in Essex. Actually, I think it was in the sociology department. And I got it, but they said, well, the good news is you've got the job, but the bad news is that it's frozen. So,
was Geoffrey Hawthorne there then?
I think he was still there then, yes. And after about 3 or 4 months, I was beginning to get worried, and anyway, sort of college job in King's came up, so I applied for that. And then, of course, they unfroze the job and said, well, you can have it if you like. By that stage, however, I was both charmed by King's, obviously, and the fact of having a job in history rather than sociology appealed to me too, although I'd been quite keen on sociology in the 60s, I felt more comfortable with history, and obviously as time's gone on, I felt that more strongly.
Can we go back to two or three things? One is Habakkuk,
Oh yes.
Hrothgar. What was he like as a supervisor?
He was fairly hands-off. I mean, it was still the time when one supervisor tended to give you a glass of sherry once a term, rather than what we now think of as graduate supervision. And he had his own hobby horses, but he wrote this marvellous book about migration of labour and capital between America and Britain, which was really good. And his own lectures I thought were good. He was not what I expected when I did get to know him a bit. I mean, he was quite sort of unassuming Welshman, really. And it was John Hrothgar Rhys, Habakkuk Rhys.
Yes, he went to the same school as Keith Thomas.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Barry Grammar School.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. But actually, of course, he only published, I think, a small fraction of what he'd been doing, because he was in All Souls, and you just noticed these boxes and boxes of things which were sort of half-finished or quarter-finished books. So he did know a lot. And when I remember he was very good when the first section of my book was all about how the labour market worked and this sort of thing, and he really had some very useful, interesting things to say. I mean, the other person I should mention is, of course, at Nuffield there was Max Hartwell. And he was very keen to set up a little sort of school around him. I mean, I was quite fond of him, but there was obviously a lot of tension between he thought he ought to get the job and sort of things like that, and then when Peter Mathias got it, he even wrote a piece saying, "This is the inaugural lecture I would have given had I got the job." But it did mean, because he was at Nuffield, that there was a little group of economic social historians who he patronised and sort of supported, so that was good.
Did you know Brian Harrison as well?
Oh yeah, yes.
I'm seeing him in a few weeks.
Well, he's
he influenced me enormously. His method,
I thought he wrote a great book on temperance at the time, and he was someone who at first seemed terribly square, if you see what I mean, and gradually sort of, I don't know whether it was over time or just if you knew him better, but anyway, unwound. And I remember because in the DMB he asked me to do the obituary or the entry on RAF, I suppose I kept it fairly formal. And they said, "But do tell us more about how inspirational he could be." And so there was a side of Brian which was very open to the sort of heterodox and the sort of unfamiliar, even though he didn't look like that at all. And he was a good thing in Nuffield, because really there was him and what's her name? He's written all about the British welfare state and social policy at the time.
He or she?
She.
Not Jill Thomas, no.
No, she wrote a big biography of Beveridge.
Yes.
And she's done various stuff on the poor law, the welfare states and so on. Her name will come back and I can fill you in for the recording. But anyway, the point is, she and Brian came into Nuffield as research fellows together. So there was really quite a strong, interesting history group there.
The other thing, you whisked over Outcast London, but that was presumably a version of your thesis which was turned into a book for a more general audience, and if you remember that a while back, could you kind of summarise what the main argument was and what you think was important about it?
Yes, I think it seems strange now because it was such a different historical epoch in which what we now think of as neoliberal ideas were thought of as part of some bad old Victorian days, and one was interested in at what point they were challenged. As I say, in Outcast London, my aim was partly to show why the question of poverty and underemployment was a dominant problem in Victorian or pre-1914 England. I was particularly interested in it because I looked at stuff on Rio and sort of various, the whole idea of the shanty town and the third world was in my mind when thinking about casual labour. And strangely, no one had really done much systematic work on it, although I did find some American economists in the 30s who had sort of worked quite interestingly on it. I used that. It was also a period which I now regard as sort of, God knows why I did it all, but when it was thought that a quantitative estimation, would make history into a much more exact science. So I did all this work on the censuses, which actually, most of which proved fairly irrelevant. I mean, so you could divide the London population into 5 registrar general classes, but actually didn't explain anything about how London worked. On the other hand, there was work done by geographers, which I found very, very inspiring, about the location of industry, the location, so you could do street maps and show why industries cluster in particular areas, how local labour markets work. A lot of that had been done in the 50s and 60s, and I built on that. And then I was interested, I was sort of on the... I mean, I was never quite a Marxist, but I was interested in the sort of problems which I thought Marx raised up. And so I was quite enthusiastic. Another of the sort of influences, of course, in the 60s on the New Left was Althusser. And I was particularly interested in Althusser because, against the idea of people simply expressing class interests, and that's what ideology was, he had an idea which, of course, has an afterlife, which is in terms of discourse, but then it was called a problematic, and it meant that it set up in a much more Saussurean way a sort of set of relation between signs, which you could still at that point connect with a class, if you like, or sort of build a class around the discourse of things. So when the third part, I was trying to explain how you got from different ways of thinking about the social problem in London, and it starts with demoralisation, which is a classic liberal idea that of a sort of poor law kind, that people should, if they don't practice thrift and so on, that they're going to gradually go down. That they should save, they should, that they could survive if they manage their incomes, etc. And then in the 80s, it becomes much more social Darwinist idea of what was called degeneration. It was the idea that the city dweller was degenerate, that London was drawing in good country types, and sort of if it went on like that, and there was all this sort of demonology about you never meet a third generation Londoner who isn't sort of imbecile of some sort. So I was interested in how these discourses change. I didn't use the word discourse at the time, but that's what it looked forward to. I was still trying to connect it with a sort of social class sort of analysis. I mean, I did so in a loose enough way where it didn't really matter, I don't think, in the end. But and I was interested in under what conditions does this idea that poverty is a fairly insoluble problem apart from charity, and so does that go away? And of course I had a very simplistic answer at the time, which was simply the First World War, got full employment for a bit, and it wasn't the same problem as before. And when you came to after the First World War, then the trade unions were organising things, there wasn't the same casual labour problem, etc. So that was part of the background, and I was interested too in the way in which historians had focused very much on the Industrial Revolution, the North, etc., and I wanted to show that actually the South was the more exciting thing to study anyway in the second half of the 19th century, and why London had this amazing reputation. And of course the East End at the time, even the time I was sort of a student, still had a sort of aura of difference about it, the Toynbee Hall sort of and a sort of London labour tradition, and obviously just the other thing, which is just good fortune, was marvellous documentation. The Mayhew and the Booth material. You couldn't fail to make it an interesting piece of work, really.
This is one of your major pieces of work. Tell me how you work. Do you tend to go for walks, or do you listen to music while you're working, or do you have your ideas in the bath? Do you have any advice on creative writing, working?
I definitely go for a walk whenever I can in the afternoon, although that's more in recent years than then, probably. I use periods of insomnia to try and work things out. Sometimes, although very often I regret that I didn't, I have a notebook beside my book bed and just sort of jot down the odd idea, some of which turn out to be very good, sort of odd thoughts one's had in the middle of the night. I tend to, I'm very old-fashioned in the technology. I use handwriting. I take extensive notes. I write the thing on the computer, but make sure I get them printed as quickly as possible, because I don't really
when
trust.
You say you use handwriting, but then you say you use the computer.
Oh, sorry. When I'm taking notes,
yeah,
it's all handwritten.
Yeah.
And my first sort of idea of planning the thing will be handwritten. So it's just when I get to actually write a chapter or whatever it is, I'll do that on the screen.
Do you use, like Brian, do you use little cards or?
Oh yes, I've got loads of the 8x5
cards, one fact, one card stuff.
Yes. And that I've still got the cards I had for Outcast London, so I've used that method all the way through. And I'm very backward. I'm learning, but I'm sort of fairly backward on the internet. I'm used to going to libraries and looking things up, and then people say, well, why didn't you look at Wikipedia or something? And very often it's true, I could have saved myself time. So I'm gradually shifting in that direction, but it's fairly slow and a bit resistant.
Right, well, let's move on then to coming to Cambridge. I think you came in, what, 73, 74?
Yes.
A couple of years after I came here. You didn't know Cambridge very well, you knew Oxford. Were there things that struck you as odd about? I suppose you knew a number of people in King's. You'd known Hobsbawm and maybe John Donne or...
Yes, the thing was that my competitor was Robert Skidelsky, but I got the job here, and at the time, like Eric Hobsbawm said, look, I've got a little influence in King's, I've got no influence outside King's. And it was true that, the thing that was slightly shocking when I first arrived was how conservative the faculty was. King's was a sort of beacon of enlightenment, really. And I felt very comfortable here. I mean, I felt nervous to start with, just would I be up to it, sort of thing. But once that feeling had passed, I thought, you're just very lucky. This is sort of my sort of atmosphere par excellence, if I could choose one, because you had these wonderfully... Well, I say one of the things that surprised and delighted me was just to find out, to meet scientists and on the electors. I mean, that was again a very illuminating experience for me, because people like Sydney, you can imagine. I mean, they could give you a wonderfully graphic picture of what this dissertation was about, what the background problem was, whether this was worth studying or not, or if you took Bernard and sort of his contempt for just the sort of routine linguistic philosophy, and so that people who thought the best thing since sliced bread, he could just side through and say, but it's trivial. So there's all that sense of assured intellectual confidence, which I suppose at the edge could look like arrogance, but I mean, on the whole, the arrogance that produced Wynne, who thought he could sort of
Wynne Godley.
Do the alternative forecasting to the Treasury, But I rather admired all that, obviously, and it was it's like we were talking just now about whether the college should introduce various bureaucratic schedules for renewal and so on, and that was so different in those days. No one would have dreamt of anything like that. And if you trust, and people did trust each other, I think, and a lot of things were done. That was the other great liberation, I think. I mean, in Oxford, I'd been a research fellow, so I didn't really have any administrative duties. But coming here, finding so many things were just done by word of mouth or on the telephone or informally. You didn't have to have a great paper chase over everything. King's also gave me the opportunity. We set up, in those days, social history was still regarded as a bit sort of outside polite society as far as the faculty was concerned. So we set up I set up with Jeff Ely and David Blackburn, actually, a social history seminar, which we had originally pioneered, Raphael, myself and Tim Mason in St Anthony's. Anyway, so I set up one here, and that became a sort of alternative focus of innovative work, sort of 18th to 20th century, and got a very large, in the 70s it was very, got a large crowd of people, and so there was a sense in which, again, what I talked about before from 56 onward, the sense of forward movement, things taking in questions no one had asked before, or sort of expanding the horizons. There was the feminism, there were new takes on empire, there was sort of black history, there were all sorts of things which were beginning to happen. Although my own taste was more as, well, in the end I got a job, I don't know whether what was cause and what was effect, but when I did get a faculty job, it was in intellectual history, which wasn't my original, as it were, what's the word? I mean, I liked it all the time, and I did it with pleasure in Oxford and the rest of it, and I always thought that was part of it. But I just thought it was part of being a historian. I didn't go for all this sort of stuff which so-called Cambridge School have had about how it's a very special, rarefied set of skills. I mean, I just think any decent historian would use those skills when asking those sorts of questions. However, I mean, there was a whole group of us who did the social history, and that carried through to the mid-90s before it ended. When King's eventually said, well, I think you're well enough established now, I don't need to support an independent seminar. I think it was Tony Tanner who sort of decided that, who I was very friendly with. No, so King's I've always found a very decent place. when I had the misfortune of trying to move house and got caught in the sort of Lawson budget about 1988-9 or something. And anyway, I found myself on a bridging loan for about 8 or 9 months. It was very unpleasant. Michael Cowdy, who was the bursar, gave me an interest-free loan for 2 years. The sort of thing which I can't imagine. Not only King's, but any academic institution would feel empowered to do these days. So that sort of informality and trust is something which I've liked most about Cambridge. I think Cambridge is a strange place because it's nearly all immigrants from one place or another, with some rather resentful locals, as it were, underneath it all. So, in some, Quentin, for instance, said,
Quentin Skinner.
Yes, Calvinism without God, and there is a certain amount of that. There really isn't a culture of sort of port swilling and this sort of thing in Cambridge. The Puritanism has somehow survived, and obviously I greatly respect that because it doesn't produce the sort of old corruption that occasionally Oxford did. On the other hand, there's something which can sometimes be a bit icy. So we've got when my parents died, they had a sort of enlarged cottage really in the Wye Valley. So we spent it's a place called Langrove, which is between Ross and Monmouth. It's beautiful country, it's between the Forest of Dean and the Black Mountains.
Lovely.
And so we spend quite a lot of time there, and I've always enjoyed the idea of having two temporalities going. Whether for a long time I lived in London, that even though I taught in Cambridge, so that was nice to have two identities. And then since the 90s I've lived more or less exclusively in Cambridge, but to have this other place in the country, again, it's a sort of just a very different pace of existence and set of preoccupations than the one you get here. So, and I value both of them. It's not that I want to retire to the country. I'd get bored stiff, but to have it always as a part of my life, I find, I couldn't imagine anything better, really.
Rick Hobsbawm has a house.
Yes.
Around there, doesn't he?
Yes, his is sort of
near Hay, I think.
Hay, yes, between Hay and Bilth, something like that.
Yeah.
No, I've been there. It's a glorious place, really.
You mentioned Quentin briefly, but there's this intellectual history stream. What about John Donne? Has he played a part in your life?
Yes. Well, probably John was one of the main people
who got you here.
Who got me here. So, and he's always been very supportive. His book on Locke still remains quite justifiably a classic, and sort of, sometimes he's not mentioned in the sort of pantheon, but I think he definitely should be. In its time, his book on revolutions was also a very good, innovative thing, and for years I taught on that. And it was part of a sort of intellectual expansive-ness of Cambridge at the time that SBS and history were able to partake in that. He also was very supportive when I had this idea of setting up something on the history of political economy at the research centre, and he very much associated himself with that. So all along I think he's played a good role in the college. I wish you'd hone closer to history sometimes, but
you can't have everything.
No, quite.
Tell me something about your collaboration with Emma Rothschild.
Yes, we had. I've known Emma since the 60s. We were, undergraduates together, although she came at the age, some ridiculous age, like 15, so actually we were a few years apart. And then she went and lived in the States, and she got a job in MIT. When I was in a position to do so, I think we set up some research fellowships in politics in the college, and I encouraged her to apply, and she got one of them. And our initial idea was that she had done quite a lot of work on peace and war in Sweden. I forget what the institute was called, but anyway, we had this idea that whereas obviously the technology of war had changed immeasurably since the ancients, thinking about war and peace hadn't changed that much. So we first set up a seminar, I think, about war and peace. People like Miles Burnett, I remember, giving wonderful talks on violence in antiquity and this sort of thing. And from there, and the other thing was that obviously economics, particularly with the passing of the sort of Keynesian generation in Cambridge, was getting more and more mathematical and technocratic and nerdish sort of thing. So as a countermove, we wanted to try to re-establish the position or the essential importance of history as part of economic knowledge, as it were. That was, and then she has wonderful connections, as you might imagine, with major funding organisations, and particularly in the United States. So we got a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to kick off, and from there we set up this centre. Again, the idea was to create studentships which would encourage students who did economics to learn some history, and vice versa. That sort of doesn't operate quite as well now, because since the coming of the MPhils and so on, people find other ways of doing that. But we still give money to support, for instance, anyone who's a postgraduate who wants to learn a language in order to pursue their research, because again the danger is the whole thing is becoming much too monoglot, really. And it's a bit like in recent years, like Herbert Morrison or something on the Labour Party, socialism is what I happen to be interested in at the moment. That's a bit like history and economics, that we if people come up with a sort of interesting exciting idea in the general area, and we can find funding for it, we will. And then we've appointed research fellows in some years, and she has been quite influenced by another part of the anal tradition, which is the mentalité, I think, because it's between intellectual history and cultural history. And what we've also thought, you see, the Quentin, John and all those people, it was always 16th, 17th century, it was always a small conversation between elites, so although it did pay attention to context and everything, it was quite a small context which was involved. We were interested in extending this into thoughts about economy or commercial society, or whatever one might call it at the time. And also, particularly once you get to the 19th and 20th century, you're dealing with mass readerships and mass opinion, and so you need a broader definition of what sort of history this is, which will be somewhere between intellectual, cultural and political history, or whatever, of economic thought in its context and its relation, of course, to the economy itself.
You then went on, well, not then went on, but I mean simultaneously, you were writing a book on poverty.
Yes.
For Profile.
That's right.
What was that about? I mean, poverty is a big subject. It was confined particularly to Britain, poverty in Britain, was it? Or
no, it's Britain and France, with a little bit on Germany. But basically what it was trying to say, it was written as a riposte, in a sense, to neoliberal arguments that Adam Smith, as it were, was best expounded by Milton Friedman, and to argue that there was no direct genealogy which led back from Chicago School or Mrs. Thatcher or whatever to Adam Smith, that in between there came the French Revolution, and that the first disciples of Smith were actually sort of radical, and he had various quite critical thoughts about law of entail, inheritance, etc. Also this strange position which you can't actually align either to left or right very helpfully, which is the grandiose ambition which you find in history, and at the same time the vanity, I mean sort of stoic sort of the vanity of riches and so on. And anyway, I wanted to show that, and obviously it was a critique of empire at the time, so to show that Smith's thought was quite critical in many areas. I don't make much claim for novelty in that. I mean, got some of it from Emma and some of it from other stuff, and was developed. I then wanted to look at how it's developed both in France and Britain, and in Britain the way in which Paine, for instance, in some sense was a reader of Smith, but of course in 1792-3, Paine gets burnt in 500 villages and towns up and down the country. So, and I wanted to also criticise the way in which, say, Malthus was very often taught as being. Malthus says he's a critic of Condorcet and Paine and so on. Actually, he hardly touches Condorcet. It's really Godwin. So he gives a false sense of being opposed by utterly naive people. I spent some time on Condorcet to just show that there was a new social thought which came along with the French Revolution. It was connected partly with the development of statistics in the 18th century, using calculus and the way in which that gets connected with life tables and life expectancy, and that this is, in a way, the origins of national insurance. And to show that that was part of the early vision of the French Revolution, it gets hit very hard on the head. Obviously the French state is more and more financially encumbered and incompetent, goes bankrupt anyway. So, and also if you look in Britain, round about the mid-90s, it's still on the agenda with Pitt and various people having poor or reform ideas and so on. It becomes anathema in the reaction against revolution, particularly as stated then by Malthus and so on. So I wanted to show that this was the first systematic thoughts of a non-utopian kind of how to deal with poverty, but that it gets, as it were, pushed into the long grass or persecuted out of existence, and how it's replaced by what we now come to think of as political economy in a more orthodox sense. And I looked in particular at people like Jean-Baptiste Say in France. However, I was interested too in showing the where the idea of the Industrial Revolution came from, which again was France rather than Britain, and through this school of Jean-Baptiste Say and so on. So, and then of course it gets picked up in the end by Bismarck, and then through to the new liberals in Britain. So it was partly, I mean, the other motivation behind the book was, that the left, intellectually speaking, had got so identified with a sort of Marx, Engels, etc. tradition. I wanted to show that there were other ways in which one could be radical and progressive in, and that this was one of the lineages, if you like, which had been forgotten and needed to be retrieved, particularly against, as it were, sort of neoliberal orthodoxies.
Thank you. And now you're recently retired, like me, but teaching a certain amount. Actually, I didn't ask you about teaching. Did you enjoy the kind of Cambridge tutorial lecturing style of teaching?
Well, what was an immense privilege, I think, was to supervise MPhils and PhD. I mean, over the years, that almost doesn't feel like work. I mean, in the sense that obviously there's some who were hard work, but a lot of them you were getting, at least I felt, one was getting as much back from them as they were giving to you, as you were giving to them. So I've had a marvellous run of students. I was going to say I've got a sort of mixed feeling about sort of supervisions. If they're in groups of 3 or 4, I think that's fine. One-to-one, as I say, can be a bit tiresome. I think we're very lucky in Cambridge with our seminar system, because it just means so many sort of wonderful people from all over the world are passing through, and it's there at your doorstep, and so much so you almost take it for granted. But we're very lucky, in fact, to have such positions. And I mean, the only thing I would say where things could be a bit more liberal, I suppose. I mean, I've now got a retirement part-time position in Queen Mary, and the good thing there is you can devise an MA option. I've done one on the shadow of the French Revolution in the 19th century, and you take 4 or 5 people and that's fine. Here in history, I don't know about other subjects, but you get appointed to teach pre-existing paper or papers, and it's very, very difficult to change the syllabus. You have to give 2 or 3 years notice or something ridiculous. So in those areas it could be a bit rigid, I thought, and we need to move in a more flexible direction. And I think I haven't got an answer to this, but I wonder sometimes whether the lecturing system is the most efficient way of conveying knowledge.
Do you like lecturing? Or?
I don't mind it. I prefer giving talks, if you see what I mean. I'm not very good at, I don't think I'm a natural, I don't joke with the audience, or I don't sort of involve them very much. I mean, I give what I have to say, and I'm happy to talk to them afterwards. It's been, on the other hand, it's what people first said to me when I came to Cambridge. It's not so much for the students, the lectures, it's to make sure you know your topics. And it did force me to get up rather systematically a whole cluster of subjects which otherwise I'd have just sort of waffled on about rather than knowing about. So that's to be said in its favour, I think.
And then to return to what I was saying, I mean, you're retired now and you're doing some teaching, but are there projects, I mean, there must be projects that you now hope you will have time to pursue?
Yes, I'm now trying to, well, I've got a particular project which I held the first session of little conference last week on 1848 as a turning point, particularly in political thought. More generally, what I'm engaged in doing is trying to write a sort of intellectual but general biography of Marx, which is taking the sort of contextual idea seriously. So, I mean, I think the Marx we've inherited is an invention of the sort of 1890, 1920 period. So I'm trying to get back to a cohort of people who, for whatever reason, think what they do in the 1840s, and to show the fragility of the lot of the thought and the misunderstandings which have given it this sort of canonical sense. I'm not wildly trying to prove something else. I'm trying to bring the whole thing back to a sort of proper study of history, and to show its contingent factors, and also it's not just intellectual history. I've got an idea about the familial relations, which are fascinating. I think I've got very interested in his father, and and the fact, of course, that I think it's a story of hubris. It's something which seems to sort of have a lot going for it in the 40s, and then he gets into this critique of political economy, which he thinks is going to be the absolute answer. So, as he gets into it, I think he finds it doesn't work. But the problem is that his wife, the only reason why she puts up with this disorderly way of life and lack of income, so he's writing the great book, right? And this is also Engels' view. So in a way, he's a prisoner of their expectations. So he can't say, sorry, this was a mistake, or, I can't go on with this.
George Eliot novel, isn't it?
Well, it's a bit like
Casaubon,
I thought. It has a certain tragic quality because he doesn't speak to anybody about it, but he gets all these psychosomatic symptoms, boils and God knows what. So, and the other thing is that he reverts to a sort of utopian socialist view, because he gets more and more seduced by this idea of the primitive communism, and sort of Mutterrecht, and sort of his main opponent in latter years is Henry Maine, because Henry Maine starts with patriarchy, but there was a more democratic
blockhead Maine.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, I think there are some new and interesting things to say. It's a bit tough at the moment because I'm just having to sort of rehearse, the history of German idealism to sort of get the thing straight. But anyway, basically I enjoy it, and there are 2 or 3 other sort of unfinished books in my filing cabinet waiting to be attended to if I get the chance. So on the whole, I'm quite happy with what I'm doing.
Well, I'm sure you will get the chance, and on a last sip, not of wine but of water, thank you very much indeed, Gareth. That's lovely.
Thank you, Alan.